Chapter 6 From Slob-Land to Snob-Land, a day in the life of a Malone Road servant. 275 years after it had been legally recognised as a town by King James I, his 6 times great-granddaughter Queen Victoria granted Belfast the status of a city. As the town had grown with the economy, the centre of Belfast ceased to be where its wealthiest citizens lived. They began to migrate from the hubbub of Donegal Square and Donegal Place, selling their former homes to commercial developers as they headed towards the emerging suburbs. Some of the older money families left Belfast entirely to make for Cultraw, Helens Bay and Hollywood, the loch-facing villages in the north of County Down. Back in Belfast proper, huge Victorian mansions were constructed in the north and east quarters. It was, however, the south section of Belfast that quickly became the one most synonymous with wealth. The area of the city leading towards a southern district called Malone was venue of a property boom in Belfast as the 1880s gave way to the 1890s. The property boom did happen elsewhere in Belfast. The Grand Opera House was built to celebrate the granting of city status in the 1880s. Also, Belfast was emerging as a much more confident city. Shortly after receiving city status, it became the most heavily populated city in Belfast. It outstripped Dublin in terms of population, and it also became the one with the highest living standards, although that's a little bit later. The gentry and the aristocracy began to sell their homes in the Malone area as those like Lord Derrimore quietly withdrew to leave and yield Belfast to her plutocratic capitalist future. The Wilson family made their fortune in this post-city status property boom. Their neighbours in Malone included a who's who of the plutocracy, the Barber family, linen and textiles, the Coreys, timber money, MacDonald's, generation upon generation of lawyers, Stevenson's, glue, not glamorous but it pays the bills, or the Johnsons' tea. The Malone Road began on an incline, a small hill that if you're familiar with Belfast today is the incline just outside Botanic Gardens on which sits the Ulster Museum, Maggie Mays and Methodist College. The rest of Belfast was built, or most of Belfast, was built on an area of slob or flat land. In fact, part of East Belfast, Ballyhackamore, comes from the Irish for town on the flat land or town on the slob-land. Anyway, as you started walking up the small hill to Malone, the joke in the 1880s was that you were leaving Slob-Land and entering Snob-Land. Malone's accent began to develop into something distinct, with inconsistently hard and soft consonants and vowels more drawled than most other Northern Irish accents. Schools were built in the area, parks designed and created, but it was those new mansions that are the focus of this particular tale, and they could not have run without their staff. Imagine we're in the home of a Malone Road family in one of the mansions, perhaps one near St John the Evangelist's Church of Ireland, or any of them emerging in Malone Park, which would become the UK's longest private residential community. We'll give them a fictional name. Let's go for Clark. And it's run by the housekeeper, who is always addressed politely as Mrs. Smith, whether she's married or not. Mrs. Smith is second in command. But it's better to think of housekeepers like Mrs. Smith as regent for the monarchy of the mistress of the house. The housekeeper is the voice of her employer, of Mrs. Clark, the lady of the house. The housekeepers keep order in the home. She watches over staff, especially the female employees, and she keeps a close watch on the household's more expensive items, including its linen, to make sure none of the staff are stealing. It's also the housekeeper's job to make sure the staff who live in the servants' quarters at the house have clean bedding for their own rooms too. A large chunk of the housekeeper's day will be spent going about the house, checking on the rooms, the furniture, as well as negotiating and trading with the Belfast tradesmen who deliver food and necessities to the house. A rare exception to the housekeeper's autocracy is the lady's maid, who alone of all the house staff is allowed to bypass the housekeeper to report directly to Mrs. Clark. The lady's maid's appearance is and has to be immaculate. It's part of the job requirement. And so she looks extremely tidy, hair combed, outfit smooth, as she sails upstairs to help her employer dress for the day. There's a long tradition of other staff disliking the lady's maid, whoever she is, because she is so trusted by their employer and spends hours every day talking to her as she helps her dress in the corsets and gowns of late Victorian high society. There's a suspicion that the lady's maid can tattletale on the other servants or influence the lady of the house against them. The lady's maid is also usually better educated, as being able to read and write fluently is also part of the job requirement. She is expected to have a certain kind of accent, or at least to speak in a way considered proper in the 1880s and 1890s. She has to be a good seamstress and trustworthy. If there's anything that needs mending in the lady's wardrobe, it's her maid's job to do so. Unless it's too difficult, in which case, as a last resort, it can be sent out to be fixed or altered. The lady's maid also has to be a skilled hairdresser, as it's her job to clean, comb and style Mrs. Clark's hair for everyday wear and for parties. Back downstairs, the housekeeper is assigning the day's chores to the parlour maids, the chambermaids, the laundry maids, the still-room maids and the between maids. Depending on their position, some were sent to light fires in the drawing room, the bedrooms, or in the master's study. They then had to make sure they stayed stoked across the course of a day, especially if it's cold outside. Bringing up ewers, bowls and towels with hot water for washing in each family member's bedroom or room is required. These have to be changed and replaced 4 times per day: before breakfast, just before lunch, just before dinner, just before bed. Sometimes it's 3 floors from the kitchen to the family bedrooms, and the water and coal has to go up and down regularly. If the house doesn't have full plumbing for a flushing loo, and at this stage quite a few don't, the staff will need to empty the chamber pots too. Beds will have to be made, then the family's bedrooms tidied, swept and dusted. Maids will be scrubbing floors, polishing grates, and when they're done, there's regular need to scrub candlesticks or oil lamps or the family silver. Down in the kitchens, the scullery maids, regarded as the lowest in the servants' hierarchy, are scrubbing pots and pans, washing dishes and helping the cook. Of all the staff in the Malone mansions in 1890 or thereabouts, the longest day probably belongs to the maids, the housemaids. At about 6 o'clock in the morning, they rise, shortly after the sun in summer and long before it in winter. She gets up, washes her face with cold water left out the night before, dresses herself and goes downstairs to make tea and possibly toast, which she would bring to the housekeeper and the lady's maid before they got up and started their day. The chores I've just mentioned kept them going until about 10 o'clock that night, maybe a little earlier in winter, when the families in Malone tended to retire earlier. This may sound exhausting, and it was, but there were serious benefits, at least comparatively, to winning a job in one of the mansions along the Malone Road or in North or East Belfast. Not only was the pay often better, but your duties, tough as they were defined. It was often a lot harder to be employed by those living in smaller homes, by less wealthy families. For in some smaller households in Victorian Belfast, a maid-of-all-work was employed. Their day started just after dawn and went on until after sunset. Days off were rare, though accommodation and food were included. They had to clean, cook, dust, maybe even care for the family's children like a nanny, all on her own or at most with one other colleague. Small wonder that competition to get a job in Malone was stiff among those in domestic service, those whose jobs made these large homes feasible, for without the servants, Victorian Malone would simply have been unable to exist.